In this chapter, we're going to handle working with events in jQuery. So jQuery provides a mechanism for working with events that is simpler than relying on the document object model. And if you've ever worked with events in modern web page development, one of the things you've probably noticed is that it's pretty frustrating because the different browsers have different ways of working with the modern event implementations. Specifically, IE has its own way of attaching events to and disconnecting them from elements, which is separate from the DOM level 2 specification, which is what a lot of the other browsers follow. And because jQuery works with sets of elements by default, it's very easy to write code that assigns event handlers to groups of objects just by using the results of the selectors and filters that we've already seen. So jQuery events basically breaks down into a couple of categories. The first is the binding and unbinding category. And these functions allow you to wire events up and take them off of elements in a simple cross-browser way. And we'll see an example of that in a moment. The next is the unified event object. Another thing that you've probably noticed if you've done web development across browsers with modern events is that the event object is slightly different between the IE browsers and other browsers. And jQuery solves that problem by creating a unified event object that exposes the properties and methods that you use most commonly in a cross-browser way. And then finally, there's a bunch of convenience features. And these are basically functions that encapsulate a lot of common event features and helper routines that work across browsers. And we'll see an example of those as well. So now that we understand what event handling in jQuery is and what we're going to do, let's see a good example. So let's begin by looking at how events are connected up to elements and disconnected. That happens using the bind and unbind functions in jQuery. And just like other jQuery functions, you use a selector to select a group of objects in the page that you want to place event handlers on. And then to create an event handler, you use the bind function. And to remove that event handler function later on, if you want to, you can use unbind. So let's take a look at functions and how they work. So for bind, there's a couple of parameters. There's the event, the data, and the handler parameters. So the event parameter basically defines the event that you want to be bound to, and it's a string that is the name of the event. For example, you'd pass in a string named click, or mouse down, or key down, or whatever event it is that you want to bind to. The data parameter is optional, and it basically defines a piece of data that will be passed into the event handler function when the event happens and that function is called. If you don't want to use it, you don't have to, but it's a convenient way of passing some data to your event handler. And then finally, the last parameter is the handler function itself, and that's the function that will handle the event, and we'll see an example of that. If you want to unbind the event, so for example, if you have a need to turn events on and off, you simply use the unbind function, and again, you pass the name of the event that you want to unbind, and then for the handler function parameter, you pass the name of the function that you used to bind with. So if you want to unbind it, you can't use an anonymous function. You have to have a function that you're unbinding. So that's the bind and unbind functions. One of the nice convenience things about bind is that you can pass multiple event names for the event parameter in one string that are just separated by a space, and we'll see an example of that in a moment. So let's take a moment and have a look at an example. Let's jump over to the code. You can see that what we have here is a div in the page, and we're going to bind some events to this element to make it change color, and we're going to see if we can find a way to turn off events as well. So let's go back to the source code and do that. So we've got a couple of style sheets defined. This is the normal style sheet, and I've made it yellow with 18 points, and that's this div right here. And then this is the highlighted style sheet. This is the style sheet that we want to have added when an event happens. And what we're going to do is define a rollover effect so that when the user moves the mouse into and out of the element, it highlights and unhighlights. So up here in the top of my page, I've got my document ready function. So I'm going to go ahead and write some code to bind an event to this element. So I'm going to write $sign. I'm going to get the ID for the event target, and that's EVT target. All right, that's the ID of, there it is right there. So on this div, I'm going to bind, and I'm going to bind an event for the mouse over, and I'm going to call the highlight function. So now what I need to do is write the highlight function. So I'm going to write function highlight, and event handler functions in jQuery always take an event object parameter. Even though we're not going to use it, I'm just going to highlight it there so you can see it. And in the highlight function, we're going to get a reference to the event target div. And we're going to call the toggle class function because we want to set the highlight class onto the div. And that's this guy right here. So when the mouse goes over it, it's going to highlight, and we're going to do mouse leave. So we're going to call the same highlight function for both mouse over and mouse leave, and that's because we're toggling the class. So if highlighted is present, it'll be taken off. If it's not there, it'll be added on. So let's now switch out to the browser and see what happens. Okay, so I'm going to bring this up in the browser. And you can see that as I'm moving over the element, it's highlighting. Okay, that's pretty good. Let's go back to the code and get a little more fancy. So now what I'm going to do is bind a click handler. And the click handler is going to shut off the highlighting function. So for the click handler, we're going to do pretty much the same thing. We're going to bind the event target. Okay, and we're going to bind a click handler. And the click handler is going to be just an anonymous inline function. And that function is going to do the opposite of these guys. So we're going to copy that, paste those guys in there, and we're going to call unbind on both of these guys. So now when I click, and in fact, let's also just tell the user, hey, you shut the thing off. So let's get this and call the HTML. Remember this from our manipulating content chapter. We're going to set the HTML of the div to be a paragraph that says you turned off highlighting. Let's go back to the browser, and we're going to refresh. Okay, now you can see when I click, I change the content and the highlighting no longer works. So that's pretty much binding and unbinding. So let's move on to our next lesson. In addition to basic binding and unbinding functions, jQuery provides some convenient helper functions that perform some common event-related tasks. So in the previous example, we saw how to bind mouse events to an element using the bind function. However, you can also use some convenient jQuery helper functions to do handling for common events. jQuery provides functions that happen to correspond to the names of some pretty common events, such as, for example, the click function. So in this case, instead of writing bind with the string click, you simply call the click function and you supply the event handler. Now, these convenience functions don't give you a way to pass that optional data parameter to your event handler, but they're nice quick ways of binding some very common events to elements. And you don't have to just use click. You can see down here in the list, there's shortcuts for all kinds of other event names. All you do is use one of these strings as the name of the function here and pass it a handler function to handle the event. And that makes the code a little bit more readable and a little bit more concise. So if you don't need to pass data to the handler function, you can use one of these convenience guys. jQuery also provides a couple of other convenient functions for doing some common event things. In the previous example, we showed how to do a hover effect by trapping the mouse enter and mouse leave events. Well, jQuery actually provides a high-level function called hover, which pretty much does exactly that. So the hover function takes two parameters, And they're a function on what to do when the mouse is over the element, and the function for what should happen when the mouse leaves the element. There's also a function to handle click toggling, because that's a pretty common thing that happens in web pages. The toggle function simply alternates between pairs of functions each time an element is clicked on. So when you click on it once, the fn function 1 will be called, then you click on it again, function 2 will be called, and then from that point on, these are all optional. So if all you want to do is define 1 and 2, that's fine, but then if you click on it a third time, this one will be called, then a fourth time, this one will be called, and so on and so forth. So we're going to see examples of each one of these in our next lesson. So let's go jump over to the code. It's pretty much the same source file that we used in the previous example, but we're going to do things a little bit differently using the convenience helpers that we just learned about. So up here at the top of the file, I've got my jQuery code already added, and you can see that I've got the same style sheet as last time. So what I'm going to do now is write some script, and the type is equal to JavaScript. Okay. So when the page loads, we are going to do a couple of things. First, let's start off by duplicating the hover functionality we saw in the previous example by using the hover function. So we're going to get a reference to the event target, and we're going to call the hover function. And the hover function is just going to call the highlight function for both parameters, because we're going to use the same toggle class trick. So now we need to write the highlight function. So that's function highlight. And remember that the highlight function essentially just takes the event target reference and toggles the class on it. And the class that we're going to toggle is highlighted. And I'll copy that and paste that. So let's jump over to the browser and see if the hover function works. Okay, I'm going to bring this up in the browser. And sure enough, you can see that it's got the same exact behavior as it did before. So let's go back to the code. Now let's use the toggle function to do something. So the toggle function, we're going to write same thing here for the event target. And we're going to write toggle. And we're going to write the function for click 1 and a function for click 2. So now we're going to go write those functions. So for function fn click 1, and we'll do the copy and paste for click 2. So for click 1, essentially what we'll do is just something very simple. We'll just set the content of the event target to be something simple. We'll just set it to click. And for function 2, we'll set it to clack, so we can see that it's working. All right, so now when we click on the element, each time we click, these two functions are going to alternate between each other. So let's go back to the browser. Let's refresh. So you can see there's the hover behavior, and when I click, you can see that the functions are alternating among each other. Okay, so that pretty much covers using the jQuery event helpers. Let's move on to our next lesson. As I mentioned earlier, one of the frustrating things about writing event handling code is that there's a lot of differences among the IE browsers and the browsers that use the DOM event model. And one of the big differences is in the way the event objects are implemented in both browsers. The IE event object and the DOM event object have a couple of properties that intersect, but for the most part, they're pretty different. jQuery helps solve this problem by smoothing these differences out and providing a single event object with the most important properties that you will use commonly. And you can see that here in the table. Now, I haven't listed all of the properties and methods because some of them are kind of advanced and esoteric. What I've done is list the most common ones. So just taking a look at the properties available, the type property is essentially the type of the event that the event object is representing. So it'll be a string representing the event name, click for example, or mouse down, or whatever. The target property is the element that issued the event. So looking at the event object, you can figure out which element in the page the event came from. The data property is optional. If you passed any data parameter to the bind function, this property here will contain that value. The page X and page Y properties are the coordinates of the mouse when the event happened, and that's document relative. The result property is the value that was returned by the last event handler function, as long as the return was not undefined. Then the return value will be contained in here. And the timestamp is in milliseconds, and that's the time when the event occurred. So those are the most common properties. There's a couple of functions that you might want to use as well. The prevent default function prevents the browser from executing whatever the default action for the event is. So this essentially stops the event from causing whatever the browser would normally do with it. So for example, following a link. The isDefaultPrevented function will return whether the prevent default function was ever called on this event object. So to see if it was ever prevented, you can check this function. And stopPropagation stops the bubbling of an event up to the parent elements. Now, it's beyond the scope of this title to explain event bubbling, but if you're familiar with the DOM level 2, what happens is when an event happens in a child element, and this isn't true of all events, but it's true mostly for mouse events. When an event happens, if the element that it happened on does not handle the event, it will then bubble up, like a bubble in liquid, to the element above it. And you can stop that from happening by calling stopPropagation. It will simply stop the element right in its tracks. And then similarly for prevent default, if you call isPropagationStopped, you can see if stopPropagation was ever called on this particular event object. So let's jump over to the code and take a look at using the event object in an example. So here is the file. You can see we've got 3 divs. And what I'm going to do is in the source code, I'm going to write some code that's going to respond to an event and set some information inside each one of the divs. So here I've got my jQuery already installed. So I'm going to write a little script. And when the page loads, what I'm going to do is set up some event handlers on each one of the divs. So I'm going to write a quick query to get all the divs and assign event handlers to them. So for the click function, I'm going to write a little anonymous function that takes the event object. And what we're going to do is just inside the div that was clicked, we're going to set the HTML content to be the contents of some interesting parts of the event object. So for example, we'll just say, let's see, page X was, and that will be event.pageX plus page Y, and that will be evt.page Y plus, and then we'll get the type of the event, and the type will be event.type plus, and that will be the, let's see, this will do the target plus event.target. And I think that probably pretty much about covers what we're going to put on there. Okay, let's try that. We'll save. And now let's jump on over to the browser. So now I'm going to bring this up in the browser. And you can see that as I'm clicking on each one of the divs, the event is happening. And you can see that the mouse position is being updated each time. Okay, let's see if this works cross-browser the way it's supposed to. Okay, so now I'm going to bring this up in Firefox. Okay. All right, there's the Firefox browser. And yep, you can see that it's working just exactly the same way. So we were able to really easily write some cross-browser handling code that uses the unified event object to get information about events that happen. So that's the event object. Let's move on to our next example. The last series of event functions we're going to cover for jQuery are some miscellaneous event functions, and these are basically provided by jQuery to handle a couple of specialized tasks. And those functions are the one function and trigger handler. The one function pretty much works the same as bind. However, the event handler is only ever going to be executed once for each one of the matched elements that the event is bound to. And you call this function when you only want an event handler to happen once. So the event will be bound, and then once the event gets triggered, it will not be responded to again. The other two functions, trigger and trigger handler, are ways of essentially triggering events from within code without having to wait for the user. The difference here is that the trigger function will trigger an event on each one of the matched elements that come back from this selector, and it will also cause the browser to act as though the user caused the event to happen. So for example, if you trigger the click event on a link, then not only will the event fire off from within your code, but the browser will act as though the item were clicked on. Now the trigger handler is similar. It does the same thing. It triggers the event handlers, but it does it without having the browser go off and act as though the event actually happened. And this only works on the first matched element in the result set for a selector. So what we're going to do now is take a look at some examples of how we might use this. We're not going to use the trigger or trigger handler. Those are pretty esoteric. So let's take a look at how the one event handler works. Let's jump over to the code. So here's the source code. Let's take a look at the design really quick. So what I have here is a series of divs, and each one has a color and a border. And what we're going to do is write some code that binds event handlers to these divs that only fire once. So let's go back to the source. So you can see that for each one of these divs, I define a style sheet. And among other things, it defines things like width and height. And you can see that there's a cursor property here in the style sheet that sets it to a pointer indicating it can be clicked on. So what we're going to do is create an event handler that only fires the click function once. So let's go up here. I've already got my jQuery library included. So I'm going to write my onLoad handler. So we're going to write function. And when the document loads, what we're going to do is get a reference to all these divs. And instead of using the bind function, we're going to use one. And what we're going to do is bind an event for click. And we'll have a function that gets called. So inside this function, we're going to set on the this operator. Remember, inside, since the click event is happening on a div, when this handler function gets called, the this parameter will refer to the div that got clicked on. So we're going to set the CSS for the div that got clicked on. And the CSS we're going to set will be, we'll change the background to red, and we're going to change the cursor to auto, so it's going to get rid of the pointer. And that should be all we need to do. So now we're going to switch over to the browser and see if this works. So I'm just going to double click on this, bring it up in the browser. So you can see that as I'm mousing over, there's the little pointy cursor. So I click on it once, it changes to red. You can see that the pointer went away, and when I click on it, nothing happens anymore. So this is basically how you assign event handlers that only happen one time. So let's just make sure that this works across browser. Going to open this up with Firefox. Okay, and exactly the same behavior. You can see that now the event handler is only happening one time. So now that we've seen how to work with events, let's try and build a practical example, and that's the subject of the next lesson. Let's take what we've learned about event handling in this chapter and build a practical example. And what we're going to do is build a function that automatically stripes and hover highlights a table. So let me show you the finished result first. I'm going to bring this up in the browser. And pardon my garish colors. I need to make sure that they're visible on the monitor. But you can see that I have a table here inside the browser. And what I'm doing is striping the tables automatically. This is being done by jQuery. And you can also see that as I hover over the rows in the table, we're seeing a highlight effect. And this is all being accomplished with jQuery. So we're going to write some jQuery code to do this automatically. So let's close this down. What I'm going to do is open up the start version of the file and bring that in my editor. So let's take a look at the design view really quick. You can see that in the design view, those stripes are not there. It's just a plain table and it's got some content in it. So let's go back to the source. What we're going to do first is define some styles that will represent the stripes and the highlighting behavior. So let's begin by writing a class named stripe1. And in stripe1, we're simply going to set the background color to, I'm just going to make some color that's going to be the stripe1, and then we'll do something similar for stripe2. And we'll call this one stripe2, and this one will be a little bit different. And again, you can change the colors to look a lot better. So those are the stripes. Then we need to define the style for the highlight. So I'm going to write the highlight style. And the highlight style is going to set the background color again. So the background color will be, I'll just define some hex value. And we'll give the font weight bold. Okay, so now we've defined our styles. So this will be the style that gets applied to the rows in alternating fashion. And when the mouse is hovered over a table row, that's the highlight that will be applied. Okay, so now we need to write the script for this. So we're going to go back up to the top of the document. And here I've included my jQuery library. And I've got a function for when the page loads. So when the page loads, we need to set up the striping. So what we're going to do, and you can see down here by the table has an ID associated with it. So in our jQuery, we will simply write a query that gets the table, and it's named the list. And inside the table, we're going to start off by striping the even rows. So we're going to get all table rows that are even, and we're drawing on our filtering and selecting knowledge here. And we're going to write add class. And the add class, recall from the CSS lesson, allows us to dynamically add a class to an element. And we'll simply add the stripe1 class. And we'll do the exact same thing for the odd number of rows. Only in that case, we'll do stripe2. So that will stripe the table. Let's save. And now let's jump out to the browser and see if that works. Okay, so I'm going to bring this up in the browser. And sure enough, you can see that the striping is taking effect. So let's try this in Firefox. Okay, we'll try it in another browser here. And same behavior. Okay, that's good. Okay, so let's go back to the code and add the hovering effect. So here we are back in the code. And now what I'm going to do is define the hovering effect. And same thing. Now for every table row, what we're going to do is use the hover convenience function. And remember that the hover function takes two functions. The function that we want to execute when the mouse enters, and the function that we want to execute when the mouse leaves. So what we're going to do is inside the enter function, we're going to say this, remember, and this refers to the table row because that's what we're selecting. So this dot toggle class, and the class we're going to toggle is the highlight class. So remember, toggle class adds a class onto the element if it's not there and takes it off if it is there. Nice little convenience function. And we're basically going to do the exact same thing in this function here. So now when we hover, we're going to highlight the row in question and unhighlight it when the mouse moves out. So let's save. and go back to IE. Okay, now we're going to refresh. And you can see that we've now added a nice little hover behavior. Now let's go to Firefox. And we'll refresh the page. And same behavior. So you can see how easy it is to build some nice cross-browser behavior using just a few lines of code. Let's go back to the code really quick. You can see that this took less than 10 or so lines of code in order to accomplish. That about covers it for events. Let's move on to our next chapter.